question of demographic, because these two issues are interlinked. We all quite often say in Brussels that migration is on the top of the agenda. It will be the next big issue for the elections. But actually, since I remember working in politics or with politicians, migration was always a key issue. And as a fact, my first paper that I had to do, my first briefing note was on migration and the crisis on migration. So I do think that migration is a big issue and that we cannot just say that it's a new issue. We need to focus on that all the time, because migration is also linked with our values, our identity, our society, and which future we would like to have for us. But as a matter of fact, of course, Merkel in the mid-2010 years, she changed a bit the rule of the game. She opened the borders by herself, imposing on all the member states to welcome refugees. We had to welcome more than 1 million refugees in a very short time of lapse of time. But after that, we saw a backlash from the society against the political elite. We can say that. And slowly but surely, we can see a small change in the political elite. I would say we can take the example of Denmark, where the leftist party tried to put a bit more radical solutions to tackle the issue. We can see that the Prime Minister of Italy, Madame Meloni, was invited at the table of the Commission to push her own ideas, to see also how we can tackle the issue at the source of the problem and not once we have the problem in our countries. So we can see that the mood is a bit changing and that we are trying to push a bit more our conservative ideas and values at different levels. To discuss this topic today, I will be joined by 3 very good speakers. The first one will be Nicolas Monti. He's the co-founder of the Observatoire pour l'immigration et la démographie, based in Paris. And I think that Nicolas also understood the need to also discuss this topic at the EU level, and you have also more plans and ideas for Brussels. Nicolas will give you a big and a good overview on the current situation, and then we'll focus a bit on the situation in France. Then we'll have Omar Sayfo, the head of research at the Migration Research Institute. He will focus a bit more on the question of Hungary and how the Conservative Party government tried to tackle this issue of migration. And I hope you will also discuss a bit the question of demographic situation in Hungary. And last but not least, my dear friend Mario Fantini, the editor of the European Conservative, will discuss a bit more the issue from an ideological point of view, but will also try to explore the tension that we might have in our family, in our conservative family, to see how we can tackle this issue all together. Mario, the floor is yours. Nicolas.
Witold, is it possible to have the presentation on? Yeah, wonderful, thank you. For switching slides, should I give you a wave? Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank New Direction and its team for their kind invitation to address this conference. I am very glad to be here with you today. As expected, I am going to share with you a few elements about the accelerated demographic changes, how continent Europe is currently facing. In accordance with the topic of today's meeting, of course, a special focus will be given on interactions between Europe's own demographic crisis endogenous demographic crisis, those related to birth rates and aging population on one end, and on the other end, on the impacts of immigration as regards the demographic reshaping taking place in many of our nations. To some extent, the views I'm going to share with you will come from a French perspective, not only because I am a Frenchman, but also because the demographic situation of France quite accurately reflects the trends at work, at least all across Western Europe, and because, along with the UK, France has been one of the very few first European countries to experience mass non-European immigration as a significant social phenomenon, beginning in the 1960s and then taking new shapes and forms in the decades following. To understand the full impact of demographic change, many of us can testify, I think it is useful to look at it from a broader perspective, that is that of Europe's demographic winter, the demographic winter our continent is currently going through. We owe this concept of demographic winter to Professor Gérard François Dumont, who is a professor in Sorbonne and who is also a member of the steering committee of our Observatoire. This concept covers a very clear and simple reality. In most of the developed countries, since the end of the demographic renewal following the end of the Second World War, the end of the baby boom, to say it more simply, we have been facing fertility rates which have been persistently below the sample level for the replacement of generations, which in countries with a good quality of health is 2.1 children per woman. However, it is important to note that the intensity of this demographic winter can vary greatly from country to country and from period to period. For example, at the turn of the 2020s, among countries in demographic winter, fertility ranged between 0.9 children per woman up until 1.8 children per woman. So these variations can be explained by a variety of factors, some of them having to deal with family policies, which are in place or not, some others having to deal with more cultural aspects. Although the demographic winter is widespread in Europe, it is not unique to Europe. It can be seen in other parts of the world, such as East Asia, for example, with South Korea and Japan, Oceania, with Australia and New Zealand, and also in Russia or in Transcaucasia. However, there is one key element that sets the situation of Europe apart. That is that this decline in Europe's fertility has been occurring at the same time as an accelerated growth in the population of the most neighboring continent, which is Africa. The average fertility rate in Africa is now at 4.18 children per woman. That is to say, double the population in Euro level. Twice as many children are born every year in Nigeria as in the whole countries of the European Union. The population of Africa has already doubled since 1990, and it is expected to grow by a further billion by 2050. Half of its population will then be under the age of 25. So the result of the situation as just described is what may be described as a reversed situation on both sides of the Mediterranean. The world's oldest continent, Europe, is now face-to-face with the world's youngest continent, which is Africa, whose standards of living are, on average, undeniably lower. Already today, 40%, as you can see on this chart, of the population of Africa is under 15, as compared with only 16% of the European population. And at the same time, almost 20% of the European population is aged 65 and above, as opposed to only 4.6% of the African population. I think I won't be surprising anyone here in stating that this asymmetry has resulted in what can only be described as a migration boom. A comprehensive look at the major trends in flows in the member states can be based on the quite robust databases which are shared by Eurostat, which is the European Commission's statistical office. Analysis of this data can reveal the full extent of the migration shock that the EU has been facing since the early 2010s. If you take a look at asylum applications, for example, 8 million asylum applications have been registered in the EU between 2013 and 2023, including 1 million in France alone, and 2.8 million in Germany, which of course is the highest number of them all. We need to measure what this means as a demographic volume. In demographic terms, these cumulative flows are somehow equivalent to the admission of a new EU member state, which would be made up entirely of asylum seekers, which would be the 15th largest member state in terms of population, just after Austria and before Bulgaria. So, of course, the granting of asylum to these asylum seekers is not systematic, but deporting rejected asylum seekers is a major problem in most countries. For example, in France, according to the Cour des Comptes, which is the highest institution for government audit, 96% of those who are refused asylum remain in the country after their application is denied. So the annual number of first applications for asylum, as you can see, has tripled between 2013 and 2023. More than 1 million first applications were lodged last year, as compared with only 338,000 in 2013. So this is an increase of 210%. Not since the migrant crisis, sorry, that's the previous one. Sorry. Not since the migrant crisis of 2015 and 2016 had this number reached again the level of 1 million. So this happened last year. And we can see that after a decrease following the migrant crisis, the trend is still upwards again. Another angle of view, thank you, concerns what can be described as the classic indicator of legal immigration, which is residence permits. The annual number of first residence permits granted in the European Union has risen by 136% between 2012 and 2022. Last year, 3.5 million first-time residence permits have been granted by the member states of the EU because, of course, this is a competence which is dedicated to member states and not to the European Union, at least at this moment, including 3.3 million in states which are members of the Schengen area. And as you know, when you're a member of the Schengen area, any national of a non-European country who has been granted a resident permit in a Schengen member state can travel throughout the area. So this is why, of course, there is also a growing interest in reforms proposals which would be designed to restrict Schengen freedom of movement only to European nationals. The moves which have been announced by the German government last week as regards the temporary reestablishment of border checks can, of course, be a signal in this direction. So, as you must know, across Europe, we are witnessing somehow a dual phenomenon. On the one hand, there is a kind of enforceable right to immigration, which is permitted by certain provisions of EU law, of broader international law as well. Of course, I'm thinking about the 1951 Geneva Convention on the Status of Refugees. Also, of course, on the European Convention of Human Rights, especially its Article 8, which protects the rights to privacy and family life. So on the one hand, there's this phenomenon, and on the other hand, there's also a political strategy, whether it is, I would say, explicitly held or not. We have governments across Europe which are trying to offset demographic decline by relying on immigration, mostly in order to renew the working population. Of course, all these migratory and demographic shifts are obviously reflected in today's overall demographic structure in our countries in a way that is absolutely radically unprecedented in European history. And to illustrate this more precisely, I'd like to take a look at the situation of France. Thanks again. For a long time, France seemed to be a relative exception among European nations, with a fertility rate which was often close to 2 children per woman. This is not the case anymore. It has fallen to 1.68 children per woman last year and 1.65 in mainland France alone. The natural balance, that is to say, the difference between live births and death on the national territory has reached its lowest level since the end of the Second World War, and it's getting closer and closer to zero. However, it is important to emphasize that this demographic winter in France conceals very different realities and even contrasting trends depending on the population segment. This is particularly true, when you look at the split up of births according to parents' own place of birth. If we take the year 2000 as our starting reference point, since the year 2000, the annual number of births with 2 parents born in France has fallen by almost a quarter, by 22%, while over the same period, births with at least 1 parent born outside of the European Union have risen by 40% and even by 72% if you take a look at births whose two parents are born outside of the EU. So this means that we are observing contradictory fertility dynamics. The native birth rate is contracting sharply, while the birth rate from non-European immigrants is increasing very significantly. This is reflected in the distribution of births in France in 2022, which you can see on the left-hand chart. Almost a third, 29% of all children born in France that year had at least one parent which was born outside of the European Union. To explain these facts, it is important to understand the combined actions of two factors, which is the increasing of migration flows on one end. I'm not coming back to it. I shared a few data at the European level. And on the other end, there is also the impact of what can be described as differentiated birth rates across certain immigrant populations. If you take a look at the specific issue of the different birth rates of immigrant populations, the chart you see here is based on the work of demographer François Héran, who is a professor at Collège de France, and in particular on a study published in 2019, which was based on birth rate data from 2014. You could see that this year, Algerian immigrant women in France had an average of 3.69 children per woman. That was not only double that of non-immigrant women, but it was also significantly more than Algerian women in Algeria. And you could see also the same differential applied to other migratory origins, such as Tunisia, Morocco, Turkey, etc. More recent data has been shared by the OECD, which told us that in France, immigrant women from outside of the EU as a whole had an average of 3.27 children per woman in 2019, which was the highest fertility rate in the whole of Western Europe and twice as much as the native women in France. So, of course, demographic studies indicate that the fertility rates of immigrants tend to fall in the next generation and that they gradually converge towards the average for native-born people. However, this convergence is slow and its effects are greatly mitigated by the acceleration of migration flows on the other end. So, among the tremendous range of social and cultural changes which are triggered by these demographic shifts, I'd like finally to focus shortly on the impact on the religious landscape of France. Of course, it's one among many impacts of demographic change. I'll still be relying on the French example, which of course is interesting in many ways because, as you may know, France now has the largest Muslim population in Europe, which is basically entirely due to immigration over the last decades. If you take a look at this chart, what you have here is the analysis of the proportion of newborn children which are given a Muslim first name. It was almost equal to zero up until the 1950s. It started rising from the 1960s up until the mid-1980s, after which it stagnated for about a decade. And then it started rising again, way more sharply from the late 1990s. It was multiplied by 3 between 1997 and 2023, according to this analysis, which is conducted by researchers Jérôme Fourquet and Sylvain Monternac. Last year, you had about 23% of all newborn boys in France who were given a Muslim first name. So, of course, in France, almost all Muslims are either immigrants or children of immigrants. The development of Islam is therefore closely tied to foreign immigration. You now have about 44% of immigrants in France who declare themselves to be Muslims, as do 32% of children of immigrants, as opposed to less than 1% of native French people without any direct migratory background. The migratory factor, as you know, as you can guess, as I explained, plays a key role in the rapid growth of Islam's presence in France. This impact is being felt in 3 different ways. There is, of course, the acceleration in incoming flows, most of which now come from the Islamic world. Among all asylum seekers which had been registered in France in 2022, you had 61% of them who came from a Muslim majority country, for example. There's also the impact of the differentiated birth rates of immigrants, which I mentioned. And there's also a third factor, which is that of the greater religious transmission in Muslim families as opposed to Christian families or, of course, non-believing families. I'm going to conclude here so that my fellow speakers can have their turn. I think you now have a fairly clear idea of the major migratory and demographic trends at work in France and in Europe as a whole. If these trends evolve naturally, that is to say, left to their own devices, they are bound to continue and grow. On the other hand, if political choices are made to redirect some of these trends, this scenario will, of course, be much more open. Thank you.
Before we move on, I would like to see if there's already one or two questions for Nicolas, because it's a very technical issue. So if someone would like to react already now, you are free to do it. So we will not take more than one or two questions, please. Yes, go ahead. If we have a microphone, maybe. And if not, you can just speak loudly.
So this is a quick one. Can you share that slide, the deck? Is that okay?
Yes, I can also speak. Yes, thank you. So yes, you have actually showed in your slides the major developments that were happening in Europe and also in France. And can you maybe give a little bit more explanation about the mechanisms behind these developments? Like, what are the reasons for these changes? Can you maybe give a short explanation?
Well, I think there are basically two ranges of explanations. One is the structural one, which I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, which is the demographic asymmetry between Europe on one end and what can be described as the global south on the other end. This asymmetry in demographics and birth rates comes along with an asymmetry in standards of living, which of course works as a strong incentive to migration to Europe, as it does towards most of the developed world, especially the Western world. And on the other end, there are, I would say, less structural and more political explanations. Overall, over the last decades, I have the feeling, it's not a feeling, I have the understanding that governments have somehow given up on their ability to control migration flows. If I come back to the example of France, among all residence permits which were granted last year, you basically only had 1/2 of them which were tied to an actual policy making. That was work immigration, that was student immigration, but all the rest was made of family-based immigration, was made of humanitarian and asylum immigration. And on these fields of immigration, governments now do not have any, I would say, degree of control at all, because these aspects are ruled on one end by international treaties, including EU treaties, and on the other end by judges who interpret these treaties when they have to decide, for example, whether one person is eligible for asylum or not. So I will mention these two kinds of explanations.
Okay, Omar, Sayfo, I think you can start your presentation.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation to join the New Direction Academy. And this time I would like to talk about the Hungarian migration policies, which is very much debated by the European Union since 2015. So as you know, when Angela Merkel declared the Willkommenskultur, Hungary was already firm in rejecting the mass and uncontrolled migration to Europe. To understand the Hungarian point of view, one should take into consideration Hungary's historical background. So during the World War I, Hungary was fighting the losing side. Therefore, the historical kingdom of Hungary was broken into a number of countries, and what left became a quite homogeneous national state. And also, there is one very important unifying factor of the Hungarian nation, which is language. So if you open up the history you open up the phone books in Hungary, you see a lot of names, family names which are not Hungarian. You find German names, Slavic names, Greek names, Armenian names, even Turkish names, because Hungary used to be a part of the Ottoman Empire, and a number of people left, stayed there after the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Therefore, the Hungarian nation is very much a cultural nation, united by a unique language, which is very, very hard to learn, and our Finnish colleagues can probably relate to this issue. The demographic image of Hungary remained quite stable throughout the 20th century because Hungary was part of the Soviet bloc. Therefore, Hungary never had colonies. Therefore, Hungary was not a top destination of immigrants from outside Europe. Only members of the diplomatic community and students. So most of the students who came from Africa and the Middle East were of middle-class background, upper middle-class background, and those who decided to remain in Hungary, as my father did, for example, who came from Syria, became integrated. There were no Arabic communities, no Muslim communities formed in Hungary, because once you learned the language, you became part of the society. And to be honest, the Hungarian society is quite welcoming. However, as you see, the ethnic background, the ethnic scape of Hungary is quite homogeneous. And also, in a historical perspective, there is this national ethos of Hungary being the defender of Europe. It comes from the Ottoman times when, according to Hungarian historiographers, Hungary played a great and key role in stopping the Ottomans to invade Western Europe. So when history kicked the doors in Hungary in 2015, it came as a surprise for the Hungarians. So the regimes in North Africa and the Middle East were toppled, who acted as gatekeepers of Europe, and in a very short period of time, more than 400,000 people arrived to Hungary, and more than 170,000 asylum applications were filed to the Hungarian system. First, actually, the Hungarian public and so politics was supportive to help the people. So when huge crowds of asylum seekers gathered in the center of Budapest and the main railway station, the civil society, the government were eager to help them. There were civilians providing food for the people, especially from the families who arrived with children. However, the situation changed quite fast. So when the Hungarian government decided to stop this influx, people gathered on the Serbian side of the border, violently attacking the Hungarian authorities. And also, it very soon came out that one of the preparators of the Bataclan massacre came to Budapest to have the transported the terrorists to Western Europe. Generally speaking, also the composition of the arrival changed the Hungarian public's approach. So first, in 2015, many of the arrivals were basically people fleeing from war, like from Syria, from Afghanistan. But later that year, the arrivals became more and more made up by young males. And many of those who arrived were actually pretending to be from Afghanistan, from Syria. As my colleagues and myself visited the Serbian borders and also certain spots in Budapest, we found out when I asked in English, some Arabic-speaking people, where you come from, they said from Syria. Once I turned to Syrian dialect, I found that they came from Tunisia, from Morocco, from Lebanon. So from countries of no conflict, but countries of deep economic turmoil. And actually, they were young people trying to escape the desperate economic situation of their country, but not fleeing war. To implement measures against illegal mass migration, the Hungarian government first had to convince its own people that this is the right things to do. Therefore, an information campaign started about the possible risks of mass migration, and actually the political happenings in Europe, sad to say, were in favor of the Hungarian government as terror attacks started and tensions arose around Western Europe. And then came a referendum when the government asked the people, are they in favor of mass uncontrolled migration? And most of the people said no. And they declared that it's only the right of the national government to decide who can settle down in the country, and it's not the duty of the European Union. So a fence was erected at the Hungarian border, which became actually one of the toughest fences to cross all around the world. When talking to people who wanted to cross the border illegally when I was doing field work at the Serbian side of the border, many of them said, or actually perceived, this as the toughest border to cross. It's controlled by the Hungarian authorities. There are surveilling cameras all around. But still, the pressure remained on the Hungarian borders. Protecting the border it's not only an issue of fences, but also of legislation. Therefore, and most importantly, Hungary makes a distinction between migrants and refugees. And to make so, Hungary introduced the concept of the first safe country. So to put it very simple, so a Syrian, once he arrived to Turkey, he is a refugee. But once he arrives to Greece, he's not a refugee anymore because he was safe in Turkey. So this is a base concept of the Hungarian government. And this is a main difference from the Hungarian point of view between a refugee and a migrant. When Hungary opens its doors for the Ukrainian refugees, some of the Hungarian government's opponents accuse the Hungarian government for being racist, accepting blonde, blue-eyed Christian Ukrainians as refugees, but refusing the Muslims from the Middle East. But actually, it was a matter of legislation. So Hungary is the first safe country next to Ukraine. Therefore, the Ukrainians who arrived are eligible to claim asylum in Hungary. And of course, there was a set of legal steps which the Hungarian government made to make sure that the authorities' actions are defended by the law. So the fence actually worked. As you see, once the fence was erected, the number of arrivals fell down very sharply, and also the introduction of the 8-kilometer rule helped. It meant that once a migrant is captured by the Hungarian authorities 8 kilometers away from the fence, he can be detained because it's a criminal offense to cross the fence or to damage the fence anyhow. And by the way, the fence which Hungary elected is not located right on the Hungarian-Serbian borders. It's located within Hungary's territory. Therefore, the Hungarian authorities are basically free to escort the people back to the Serbian side of the fence. And in 2016, the Hungarian government also constructed a transit zone next to the fence. It meant that those who arrived to Hungary were escorted to the transit zone, should wait until their asylum application was proceeded by the authorities, and was only allowed to leave the transit zones to the Serbian side, which is basically still was located in Hungary. Therefore, when Hungary is accused of pushback, the pushback of asylum seekers and migrants, it, legally speaking, is not entirely true, because the fence is located on Hungarian soil, and those who are escorted back are still on Hungarian territory. Please. And things got wild, because obviously migrants still wanted to reach European Union, and on the other hand, Hungary had to fulfill its Schengen obligations, namely to protect Europe and keep the gates of Europe safe. Which is very much unknown for the European public. Like a Wild West emerged on the Serbian side of the Hungarian borders starting from 2018 with rivaling human trafficker groups fighting each other for territory and making people pay for helping them to cross the borders, and also basically terrorizing those who were not willing to pay them money. So many of the groups or these mafias were controlled by Afghan individuals and Moroccan individuals fighting for the best territories to cross the borders. They became armed very quickly by armed traffickers from Kosovo. And basically, they were posing a big challenge for the local communities on the Serbian side of the border who started to feel unsafe because of the presence of armed foreigners in their neighborhood. Unfortunately, the Serbian government for a long while were looking on the human traffickers as part of the solution, as they escorted people to Hungary. Therefore, the people were not, the migrants were not stuck in Serbia, causing problem for the local authorities. However, last year in November, there was a shooting between rivaling Moroccan and Afghani gangs, and 3 people were killed. And there was a coming election in Serbia in December. Therefore, the Serbian authorities started actually to detain human traffickers and escort the migrants back to the southern parts of Serbia. And still, detention on the Hungarian borders are eased. But still, we don't know how long it will last. Certainly, Hungary is not closed to foreigners, be they from even the European Union or from the outside. And if you visited Budapest, you saw that there is a vibrant expat communities residing there, a vibrant multiracial, multicultural expat communities residing in Budapest who choose the capital of Hungary as a home, as their temporary home because of living. And also Hungary is in a dire need for workers and laborers, especially as there are a number of German and other car companies are setting up their base in Hungary. Therefore, the Hungarian labor market needs about 100,000 and even more qualified workers. Therefore, last year, the Hungarian government introduced a new legal framework for guest workers to Hungary. Learning from the experience of Western Europe, which started in the 60s in the case of Germany or the Netherlands, when people from outside Europe were invited to the country as guest workers, then became nationalized and family unification was allowed, the Hungarian government chose a different path. Therefore, those who arrive, first of all, only specific agencies can recruit all these people, and they hold responsibilities for the act of the people in Hungary. Foreign worker in Hungary who arrived in this framework cannot stay more than 2 years in the country, and his stay can be extended with another year, but not more, not in any cases. Family unifications are not possible. And basically, this is it looks like a good deal for for people of the 17 countries which Hungary signed a contract with. So now we see people from the Philippines, from the post-Soviet region, from India arriving to Hungary and finding jobs in specific companies. Still, Hungary has some ongoing issues with the European Union, and most of these issues are dated back to 2000, so for 2020. Hungary has to pay 200 million euros as a penalty for the European Union for not applying certain legislations. One concern of the European Union was were the transit zones, which I mentioned before. Actually, they said that Hungary had no right to keep these people in the transit zones. However, it's strange enough that according to the Migrant Pact of the European Union, Hungary is obliged to host more than 7,000 people in Hungary and host them in similar transit zones. And also, Hungary was fined because it said that no asylum application can be filed at the borders later on when the transit zones were closed. Only it can be done at the consulates, Hungarian consulates in specific Balkan countries, and of course in countries of origin. This was regarded problematic by the European Court of Justice, and also that people smugglers were released from the Hungarian prison. To understand this issue, one should take into consideration that the Hungarian laws were extra harsh on human traffickers. At one point, about 20% of the Hungarian prison population were charged with crimes related to human trafficking. And simply the Hungarian prison system, without the European Union's help, was not capable to keep all these people. Therefore, those who were not charged with serious crimes were left to go to their homeland and have to sign a petition, sign a promise that they will not enter the European Union. But at this point, the Hungarian government was not able to do otherwise. And as we see, the Hungarian example became quite popular all around Europe with the intensification of migration. But still, the Hungarian government is paying for the costs of building and maintaining defense on the Hungarian borders. Meanwhile, the Baltic countries are somehow supported by the European Union to erect their fences and protect Europe. Hungary is still facing and have to pay fines for doing something similar on the southern borders. And thank you very much. I think I'm still in time.
I don't know if there's any question that you would like to ask directly. And Elizabeth, please. Yes. We'll bring you a microphone.
Thank you very much for the presentation on Hungary. I have a small technical question to ask. Suppose a foreign worker, say Filipino for instance, works to Hungary, signs the contract that they say for 2 years and they can extend 2 more years. And in the meantime, they learn Hungarian and they decide they like the country. Can this be changed?
Pardon? I didn't understand the last part.
Suppose a migrant worker who in theory has signed a contract to work in Hungary for 2 years, which is extendable for 2 more years. In the meantime, they fall in love with the country and they decide to stay longer and they learn Hungarian. Can this be changed? So can they stay longer?
No, they have to exit Hungary and apply for a different kind of visas. The same applies if they find, for example, a Hungarian spouse. Then they have to leave the country, file a different kind of visa, and then they probably have the right to come back.
And you are not afraid that these people will stay even after the 4 years, like illegal migrant not receiving asylum?
Yeah, actually, as I mentioned, here comes the role of the companies who are responsible for recruiting these people. So if this happens, they hold the whole responsibility and they obliged to pay fines. And basically, there are pro-profit companies are interested in maintaining a good business relationship and continue recruiting people. Therefore, they are scanning those who they are working with.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for both Mr. Monti and Omar. You mentioned that birth rate in France is 1.88. That is
1.68 last year.
1.68. But I believe France has one of the highest birth rates, I believe, in Europe. I believe in many European countries it's much worse. For example, the birth rate in the Netherlands was between 1.6 and 1.7 the last years, but since this year it decreased to 1.43. And the reason behind that further decrease is that we have a housing crisis at the moment, and as a result, couples are delaying having children because they cannot afford a house or their house is not big enough. But I've looked into the data and I noticed there are also regional differences in terms of birth rates across the Netherlands. For example, you have a region in the Netherlands, it's called the Bible Belt. It has a population of, let's say, 500,000, and it's mainly Orthodox Protestant Christians. That they are basically the voters of SGP. It's a political party, also part of the ECR group in the European Parliament. And but their birth rate is between the 3 and 4. So that is that's more than twice of the national birth rate of the Netherlands. My first question is, do you also see significant differences in birth rates between the atheist population in France and Hungary? So do you see difference between the atheist women and let's say the religious Christian women? And my second question is, I think the reason behind the decreasing birth rate is mainly socio-cultural. So I think factors like atheism, feminism, and of course economic factors contributes to a declining birth rate. My second question was, what are, according to you, the factors behind the decreasing birth rate amongst the native French and Hungarian women? And how can we increase this birth rate to the threshold of 2.1, besides financial stimulances such as tax benefits in Hungary and free childcare?
You want to start, Omar?
Yep, you can start.
Okay. Well, to answer the first part of your question, of course, religiosity plays a key role in the differences between the birth rates of certain segments of population in France. The situation of France is specific in the sense that we are one of the most secular nations in Europe. Of course, you still have, I would say, visible minorities of practicing Christians and especially practicing Catholics who tend to have more children than the average native French on the whole, but their share in the whole population is now statistically not significant enough to reverse the bigger trend I mentioned. What has to be said anyway is that there's a desire for children among the French, which is actually higher than the actual birth rate that can be seen. The opinion polls which are made on this issue always says that on average, French women, for example, and French men as well, would like to have something between 2.3 and 2.5 children, which is 50% higher than the actual birth rate. So there's a cultural issue, of course, but even within this culturally deteriorated situation as regards fertility, there still is a desire for children. So this leads us to another aspect, which is more closely linked to policy making. Of course, family policies do not have to be understood as some sort of centralistic, constructivist policy making, which would oblige people, and especially oblige women, to have children they would not want to have. They have to be understood for what they are, that is to say, policies of freedom, policies which give people the actual tools, the actual means as far as housing is concerned, as far as kindergarten are concerned, as far as anything needed for having children in the most comfortable way possible are concerned. And to this regard, I think there is interesting lessons to be learned in the I would say the simultaneous approach to the French situation and the Hungarian situation, because I mentioned the decrease in birth rate in France. Over the same period of time, there has been a significant increase in the birth rate of Hungary, which was something like 1.25 children per woman in 2010, and it is now something like 1.61, around this, I think, which is, of course, a significant increase. There is a time, which may be even next year, in which there will be, I would say, a crossroads, that is to say that the birth rate in France will be lower than the birth rate in Hungary, while the situation was diametrically opposed a decade ago. So this shows that politics can do things on birth rates, and this is, of course, a kind of policymaking conservatives should not give up on.
Well, speaking about religiosity and the number of children in a family, I cannot rely on exact data from Hungary. I haven't seen such a poll, so I cannot answer your question. In the case of Hungary, however, the government introduced a number of family policies, family support policies in 2011, which actually did work, as we saw. So as Nicolas mentioned, from 1.25 child per woman, it increased to 1.6 and more. Actually, unfortunately, at the time of COVID, it fell down, so it's now again 1.4 something. And unfortunately, these policies came a bit later. So in the Western world, we're usually talking about the baby boomer generation. In Hungary, for different political and historical reasons, this baby boomer generation was born in the 60s, and unfortunately, and also in the early 70s. So so when they came to the age of having their own children, that was the worst historical period at the end of socialism, at time of political uncertainty, economic collapse. Therefore, the number of children declined. So when these measures from the government came in 2011, it was already late. So the demographic, the number of those who were eligible to apply for this government aid were extremely low. Still, I think this is quite a big thing. And the government is quite generous. So if a young couple decides to have 3 children, they are eligible, among many other helps, for like about 70,000 euros cash from the government to establish their home. But unfortunately, money alone cannot change culture. So what data shows that most of the people who are eager to have their own children are living in neighborhoods where are already a lot of children, and live in an environment where that's very much in the culture to have children. And this is not the case, unfortunately, in Hungary and in Western Europe recently.
And I think, if I may add, we should also pay attention to the case of Czech Republic. I think Czech Republic has a quite good natality rate, 1.68. They have a good social system, but it's not as generous in Hungary, but we can see that the birth rate is quite high, and it's without counting a big migration wave to Czech Republic. So I'm always wondering why in Czech Republic we have this culture. We know that religion in Czech Republic is not so important, and still we have this birth rate very high. So if someone will have an answer one day, please come to me. We have still 2 questions. If you can keep your question short, please, then we have the time to answer to them.
Yes, I have a question for Omar, about the new legal framework that you mentioned. Are there any noticeable economic consequences of this framework?
In the guest workers,
yes,
you mean?
The new contracts that they sign.
Well, basically, recently there are more than 100,000 people from outside Hungary are working in Hungary, and most of them are, of course, from the European Union. But those who came from third world countries, their number is increasing, and we see the most important economic consequences is that the factories are working. So otherwise, there's no labor. Which you can find. Historically speaking, most of the guest workers in Hungary came from the Ukraine and Serbia. However, after Serbia started its negotiations with the European Union, Western Europe became a #1 destination for the Serbians, not Hungary anymore, which is geographically closer, but the wages are not as high. And for Ukrainians, Hungary is not the #1 option anymore, because after the war started, Ukrainians became eligible to apply for jobs probably all around Europe. Therefore, the geographical proximity became less important for many, especially that the prospect to return to the Ukraine is very low for lots of people.
Hi, thank you for the talk. Could you comment a bit on the relationship between these two trends of the plummeting birth rates and the exponential rise in mass migration? So we know that in some countries, the justification for mass migration is that we have aging populations, and this is a way to gird ourselves against the economic decline that can come from that, or the labor shortages, rather. Is there a causal relationship either way in which declining birth rates are correlated with mass migration, and does mass migration have an effect on depressing birth rates?
Should I start? To answer the first part of your question, you're perfectly right. There's this idea, in my opinion, which is flawed, but which is widely shared in many European governments, that immigration is an answer, if not the only answer, to demographic decline, and especially to the decline of the working age population. This leads us to a specific topic, which is that of at least in France, the pretty low level of integration of immigration into the labor market. I'm coming back to the OECD data I mentioned in my talk. In 2020, you had only half of all extra EU foreign nationals in France in working age, which were in a job. So it was 14 points lower than French nationals, for example. You have a poverty rate among non-European nationals in France, which is the highest in Europe, equally with Spain. We have almost half. I think it's 47% of non-European foreign nationals in France who are below the poverty level in France. So it is 4 times as much as for French nationals. So this leads us to an important topic, which is the economic and fiscal assessment of immigration. In the French context, it is bad. As far as other European contexts are concerned, it's rarely very good, actually. We mentioned the case of the Netherlands. In 2023, the economist Jan van de Beek published a study called Borderless Welfare State, which was designed to assess the fiscal impact of immigration in the Netherlands. It was bad overall. It was especially bad for some areas of origin, especially Middle East and Africa. There are several reasons for this, one of them being the gap in the level of skills and qualifications. So I think migration as an answer to demographic decline is both quite a flawed answer on the one hand, and if not flawed, it is at least very short-termist, let's say.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with Nicolas. And I would like to stress, it's my opinion that there, in the public discourse, when it gets to migration in Europe, too much emphasis is put on the numbers and too little emphasis is put on the legal status of the migrants. So if you take a look on Singapore, 1/2 of the population are foreigners. If you take a look on specific Gulf countries, 80% of the society are foreigners. Still nobody's talking about non-nationals endangering the national culture, for the very simple reason that the guest workers cannot have citizenship, and not even their children. And once somebody contradicts the laws or does something criminal, he will be sent back to the home countries, and there will be thousands of people very happy to fill his place. So I believe in the European case, the problem started not when people of different backgrounds were arrived, but when the government provided citizenship for people who were at a very low level of integration, and also made family unifications possible without taking into consideration the level of integration of specific individuals.
I'm not aware of any scientific evidence in this direction at the moment, but that will have to be investigated more deeply.
Okay, thank you. Now I think it's time to move to our last speaker. Mario, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I know you'll find it probably richly ironic that the great-great-grandson and grandson and son of immigrants to Italy, Argentina, and the United States is going to speak to you now provocatively against immigration of all kinds. But give me a chance. I'm actually going to start by talking about one of my favorite topics, which is books. Books which never judge me. They lie there, they open themselves up to me. And I want to mention three that have warned us of exactly what we're living through here in Europe and in the United States. First, 30 years ago, Robert Kaplan, an intrepid world traveler and journalist and foreign affairs specialist, wrote an article that he turned into a book later called The Coming Anarchy. Basically, in that essay and then later book, he talked about the coming struggle that we would see between primitivism and civilization. And he argued that environmental degradation, political corruption, poverty, famine, and general disorder were weakening states across the global south, what we used to call, charmingly, the third world. And as a consequence of these factors, rural populations in the third world, I have no qualms about using that term, would increasingly migrate toward first urban areas in those regions, and then find their way to the urban centers of the rich industrialized West. Now, Kaplan's was a calm, sober, carefully worded warning to the West. A decade later, the homosexual aesthete Renaud Camus wrote his notorious book on the Great Replacement. Now, you're not supposed to talk about this book. You're not supposed to refer to it because it's automatically racist. Nonsense. It's also a very thoughtful essay arguing much the same that Kaplan was arguing, but focusing more on the decline of the native-born populations of Europe. Now, of course, both Kaplan and Camus were preceded in 1973 by the even more notorious dystopian novel, The Camp of the Saints, by the French man of letters, Jean Raspail. Kaplan's essay caused a minor kerfuffle, but was quickly forgotten. Camus, the books by Camus and Raspail, in turn, were suppressed, shadow banned, treated as toxic, racist, and most people thought relegated to the dustbin of history, and kept in circulation only by a few daring souls on the traditionalist Catholic right, mostly in France. And all their warnings, and you can even look at Enoch Powell's famous speech, right, going further back. But all these warnings, and there are many others over the decades, have been ignored, and as I said, suppressed, and have gone unheeded. Now, I'm convinced that part of this is because, as the young man over there asked, we're talking about the need to import migrant workers. I'm convinced that a lot of this has been ignored willfully by the rich countries of the West because we need workers. And they want to allow for the greater movement between countries to import those foreign workers to feed the capitalist machine, to feed the industries, because Europeans are not having children. By the way, I think anything under 2.1 is meaningless, right, for a replacement rate. The ruling economic and political elites of Europe and the United States have been convinced, have been trying to convince us through the pages of the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and other organs that migration from the third world is necessary. It's a beneficial, good thing, as it brings much needed economic input, labor, to countries where there's a dearth of workers. Now, what is the result of all these policies of the 2015 opening of the borders by Merkel? I look around and I see chaos and rising crime. I think that the results have been disastrous. Just ask young mothers of children in Sweden or Italy or France. It's been documented by some people. In Sweden by Paulina Neuding. She's written about it. Courageous. tough. I think she lives with protection now because she said things and has reported on things that you're not supposed to say about foreign-born migrants. It's also been accompanied, these flows of migrants into Europe have been accompanied by growing numbers of attacks on Christian churches, religious sites, vandalism, as documented by the Vienna-based Observatoire on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe. And they put out an annual report. These flows have also been accompanied by growing street crime, robberies, assaults across European cities and towns, as documented by the dogged researcher Pierre-Marie Sèvres at the l'Institut pour la Justice in Paris. Now, of course, this perceived correlation between one phenomenon, inflow of migrants, and these other disastrous consequences, we are told, are just a coincidence. They're not related. Prove it to me, Mario, that it's related. Do a statistical analysis. I can't. But our common sense, my common sense tells me that there is a connection. Of course, the response of governments and authorities across the West is not to release much of this data. A lot of police departments won't identify the perpetrators of crime. In the media, they often don't tell you, so-and-so was gang raped by disgruntled youths or something, but there's never an identification of where they're from, their ethnic background. But precisely because we don't know, because we don't have access to the data, because we're being prevented from knowing the details, the granularity of the data behind all this, precisely because of that, this is the most important issue facing Europe now. It's an existential threat. And it is changing our societies. It has changed our societies. All right, but what do I know? I'm not a number cruncher. In fact, I'm even an interloper. I was born in the US. I don't belong in Europe, do I? In fact, someone asked me yesterday, how can you, an American, lead the European conservative? Well, I would argue I am European. There was a time when Americans used to see themselves proudly as descendants of Europeans. No longer. To talk that way is kind of weird for a lot of people. But on one side, my Latin side, descendant of originally Spanish immigrants, and on the other side, Italian immigrants. So there is a European connection, and I think that European-American connection has to be talked about. We have to be reminded of it. Anyway, that aside, what do I know? Well, I've been here in Europe for 25 years, and I love to talk to people, cab drivers, shop owners, anybody who will give me their time of day. And I'm curious. You know, I'm always asking questions about their families, their background, why they're here, if they're immigrants, etc. And I know it's just anecdotal evidence, but in the last 5 years, what I've been hearing from all these interesting people who are working and living and sacrificing themselves for their families out there, what they've been saying in the last 5-10 years is very different from what they used to say to me 25 years ago. It is anecdotal evidence, hearsay evidence, but it doesn't mean it's not valid or true. It just says that, it tells me that we're not being told everything by the media and by the authorities, our ruling elites. Now, a lot of people, more and more, it seems, are doing some kind of what I'm calling citizen journalism. You can find their little video reports or video documentation on various platforms. You can go to TikTok. I don't recommend it. It is a Chinese espionage tool, so get a separate device if you're going to use TikTok. But it's fascinating. Forget the bikinis, forget all the junk that's on there. There's a lot of interesting stuff that people are posting there. Attacks in McDonald's in Paris, attacks on the streets, gang attacks on young little boys in Germany. People are posting this stuff. None of it gets reported. Where is it? Where is it in the mainstream media? Where are the headlines? Now, even if you discounted half of that stuff as deep fakes or some kind of Russian disinformation, there's still so much out there that it should worry us, it should concern us. Something is definitely wrong. Just a few weeks ago, I arrived in Torino, in Italy, around 9 p.m., and as I left the train station, there were army units outside. I said, oh, it must have been a bomb threat or something. I got in the cab and I asked, and he said, no, that's usually what, after a certain time of the day, they have to bring in military units or police because there's so much crime. And I played dumb and I said, what you mean like local Italian youths and their posses going out? And he said, no. All the waves of immigrants we've received in Torino. Now, I want to take now a moment to look at very quickly, one of the economic arguments. I referred to it earlier about that we need these workers, we need foreign workers because we need labor. We're told that that demographic problem in Europe necessitates that we import more and more workers. But I think there's at least two misconceptions here. First of all, I like to think of labor, which is an input, as another form, something like capital. Capital is another input, right? And people often think that capital is homogeneous, that there's one kind of capital, we need free-flowing capital in and out of countries. But it's not true, is it? There's different kinds of capital flows. We have, bear with me for a moment, I know it gets a little boring here. We have portfolio investment flows. It's one kind of capital, goes in and out of country. It's hot money, right? And then we have FDI, foreign direct investment. It's a different kind of capital. They both have different time horizons. They both function in different ways. They're both used in different ways. The same kind of parsing or nuanced view of labor should be used. In other words, you can look at labor, L, I think, isn't that the mathematical notation for labor, or W? You can look at it as a homogeneous thing, but it's not. So to say that we need more workers here in Europe means that we need more of a kind of worker. We need certain kind of workers. We need a certain kind of labor input. The people we're getting aren't the kind of workers we need. They can be trained, they can be educated, but that does not take place overnight. Now, for years, the World Bank and others have pushed ideas like participatory development and local capacity building. And I used to work at the World Bank, so I pushed some of these programs in Bolivia with the idea that you would train and educate the local population so that they could end up in positions of some influence in their municipalities or their government offices and help develop their own country. How can this occur if so many people are now leaving their countries to come to Europe? Who is left behind to help develop Somalia, Libya, a dozen other countries? Who's going to do the development? The experts in Washington who get flown in? Shouldn't it be the very people of those countries that participate in the development of their own country? I mean, these are all things that keep me up at night, and questions that we should all be pondering. Another aspect of this question regarding labor and the flows of immigrants, it gets back to my comparison with capital. And I was thinking the other day, you know the name Hernando de Soto. He wrote The Other Path and then The Mystery of Capital, and a very interesting Peruvian economist. And he also talks about capital not being homogeneous, that there's just different kinds of capital. He talks about how to unlock capital from assets, from hard assets. But he has the following line. He explains that capital has two jobs and does two things simultaneously. First, physical capital captures the physical dimension of assets, like livestock. That's capital. It's a physical thing. But here's the interesting part. Capital also captures or contains the potential to generate surplus value. That is key for me, because let's apply it to labor. Foreign workers, immigrants, they have to have the potential to generate surplus value. What I said earlier, they have to have the capacity to contribute to an economy. Are the people who are coming to Europe or entering the southern border of the United States those people? They are not. We've seen that. We've seen the stats. My little town in Vermont has accepted 200 families. Well, the Washington agency in charge of relocating families has imposed on Vermont 200 families from Afghanistan. Half of them are illiterate. Who's going to take care of their development? I don't understand how all this works and how it plays out. Now, it's not me being uncharitable. It simply comes down to this. People, human beings, are not fungible goods. They're not interchangeable. There are qualities that have to be discerned, that you have to identify, that you have to recognize. And this is the mystery of human resources, of capital as human beings, and how to develop them. But the answer is not simply bring them here and give them a stipend and put them on the outskirts of Paris or Copenhagen, because there you will leave them to their frustrations. You won't be assimilating them, which is another part of the equation, and they'll be festering in their anger and resentment and frustration, as we've seen in the banlieues outside of Paris and in parts of outside of some Scandinavian cities. The screen went off, so I don't know how much time I have, because I have one or two final points to make. How are we? About 5 minutes? Well, the other aspect, not economic anymore, has to do with identity. We're told, or we've been told, that speaking about national identity, cultural identity, is also verboten, not allowed, smells of racism. But every country and every civilization has once been proud of its society and its traditions and its literature. Europe had that. Europe and all the many nations that make up Europe. And there is something that is called Europe, and it goes back to Herodotus and Aristotle. It's not a recent invention. There is a European civilization made up by that great diversity of those countries that make up Europe. But the habits, the manners, the mores, the customs that make up that Europe, or European civilization, are under threat, being eroded, being pushed aside, being replaced by a new set of values, customs, manners. I want to bring up the really controversial topic of the hijab or the burqa and the use of it in Europe. There are people who say it's an affront to the European way of life. And you can understand that if you reflect on, for example, what Roger Scruton said once when he was writing about the face, the importance of the face, the visage. In European civilization, it's necessary. You encounter someone, you self-disclose yourself to the other with your face. That's the first thing you connect to, the eyes, then the rest of the face. How can that process of trust building, of understanding the other, happen when it's covered? That's a simple example, and perhaps simplistic. Another way I like to look at it, at human beings, is by using the analogy of the terroir for wine. For you wine lovers out there, right? The terroir is an interesting concept, right? Because it talks about climate, topography, soil, water, the minerality, the history of the region, all gives that wine its essence, its personality. It extends to human beings too, right? Every human being is the product of that terroir. The same factors behind the terroir that we think of when drinking wine contributes to the development of people's identity. And all this is under threat, has to be defended. Look, I began referring to a few books. I'll end with referring to one more book that I recommend, and that is pointed out what could happen with uncontrolled third world immigration. The book is called Cry Wolf, and it's by Paul Lake. They're calling it came out in 2003, so it was called Orwell's Animal Farm for the 21st Century. And the story is, there's a farm, the population's all these animals, they live in community. They live pursuing the common good. There's justice, there's order. And there's one commandment that all the animals live by: no trespassing. But it's violated one day when an injured doe arrives at the gate. And there's a discussion among the animals, like, do we let this injured person in? And they say yes. Let's do it for once. But then others arrive, opossums, raccoons, squirrels, and they strain the resources. And those newcomers, those new animals have different ways of living, and they don't understand that commandment of no trespassing. And it adds tensions and disrupts the civil order in this little farm, and it all descends into a bloody war of all against all. Sound familiar? I think that's the direction we're headed in. And I'll just end with the not too optimistic comment that we can talk about this all we want. We can think of policy reforms and shutting the gates and erecting walls and et cetera, but I think it's too late. I think the conversation should be shifting is how do we manage our decline? How do we manage the situation in which we're in now? Because there's no reversal. Anyway, thank you. I hope you'll still talk to me after this.
We still have a few minutes for a few questions. If you can please keep your question short. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your speech. You talk about the need for certain workers, migrant workers, but the majority of the immigrants are not that type of workers. And you talk about the capitalist machine. And my question is then, should we, as European countries, head to another legal framework like Hungary have now? Or should we have an alternative, so a kind of different economy, maybe let some industries disappear or outsource to other continents, or maybe more robotization like Japan, because in that way you don't even need migrants anymore. And for example, for the Netherlands, the biggest group of migrants that come to the Netherlands are migrant workers, so that would be a huge change. What are your thoughts about this?
Can you clarify the question for me? I mean,
it was a question about the migrant workers, and if we should maybe have robot instead of migrant.
no, I mean, you know, you could approach it as an economist and say, well, the lack of migrant workers, that's a lack of supply of an input. Well, maybe some of the industries should shutter. Maybe we should allow some industries to shut down, shrink. I know we're on this path of inexorable growth, all right? And we got to keep growing and expanding and scaling up. But perhaps we use the lack of workers to simply say, well, let's allow a little creative destruction, and all those industries that have been around for 30, 40 years, if they don't have enough workers, well, maybe they're going to have to curtail production. Maybe that's the approach we should be taking. I don't know, but it seems to me that we have blind spots in terms of economic arguments, and we don't apply them as ruthlessly as we should, perhaps.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for the talks. One of the primary tasks of governments is to give a safe space for its citizens, security. Why do we give global human rights priority about national civil rights?
Great question. Because it's imposed and pushed on us, I think, by a variety of international and supranational structures and entities and organizations and multilaterals, and they keep pushing it on us. And then we're expected to abide by what they decree in the UN or other bodies. And this is why national sovereignty or the nationalist revolt we've been seeing slowly emerging is so important. I think every country has to determine its own national interests and forget what the so-called experts, whether it's New York, Davos, London, I don't know, wherever, are saying. That's one explanation, I think, for why what you described is happening. There are other reasons too.
Great, thank you very much. I was about to touch on that. I should say, by the way, the Adam Smith Institute has this morning published a paper on immigration, so if anyone wants to check that out, it's called Selecting the Best. what I'm interested in is a term we've come up with called human quantitative easing, which I think you touch on quite well. Do you think this is just, immigration is just one of those issues? When we talk about fertility, the research we've done, we found it comes down to the very nature of Western capitalism being very career-focused, and women are reluctant to leave the workforce, and the fact our houses are too small, and you know, it's a huge problem in that sense. But also energy prices and the reluctance to invest in hard capital. So we see TFP dropping quite considerably. Do you think it's a more fundamental problem of our economic system that short-term decisions like human quantitative easing is taken over roboticization and automation, and essentially long-term benefits that are quite expensive at the short front, you know, on the short end, but very expensive on the long, less expensive on the long, such as capital investment? Interested in your thoughts.
It's not just in those areas. All of us, right? Or, yeah. Okay. It's not just in those areas, of course, right? The short-term thinking has affected and afflicted us in so many ways. That's another problem, right? How do we reorient a whole society or political regime to think in long-term ways? Some countries in this world do think in those terms. I'm thinking the Chinese and others. We in the West, for some reason, we're just so focused on the short term, on the quarterly profits, on the shareholder reports. That is a big limitation in many ways, beyond what you just said. Anybody here?
Maybe just to comment on one thing you said about the correlation between the priority given to career among women and the issue of fertility rate. There is a counterintuitive truth, which is that overall on the European level, you tend to get quite a positive correlation between the level of engagement of women within the workforce and birth rate. Like the counterexample to this is clearly Germany. For decades, it has been very hard for German women to have children and a career at the same time, because there was no I'd say shared structures for children keeping, for example, because there was also a cultural bias which was heavily critical towards women who chose not to stay at home. So I would say that a counterintuitive conservative policy regarding birth rate would be to encourage women to get into the workforce and to make it easier for them to have both children and a career at the same time.
Hello, Lisa de Bruin. I just wanted to comment on that whole topic firstly, around the birth rate. I totally agree with what you just said. I run an organisation called the Countess, and we are a feminist organisation, but we centre motherhood in our feminists, and there is a nascent movement within feminism which does so. And when women are asked in Ireland, you know, what they actually want, I'm not talking about state-sponsored feminism telling them what they want. I'm talking about women being asked. They all want to be at home with their small children. And if the state was able to help them to do so, they would have more children. Firstly. Secondly, tax was individuated in Ireland in the 90s, so it wasn't just that people became less religious and less Catholic and had smaller families, it was also that it didn't pay to have a mother at home. You know, I grew up in an Ireland where most mothers were at home. There was a stay-at-home mother, and therefore families were bigger. If it's too expensive to have children and feels too impossible to mothers who do not want to leave a 6-month-old in a creche all day long in order to go to work, then the families will continue to shrink. I also just had a kind of a question to the panel vis-a-vis, you know, my work centres around pushing back against the worst excesses of trans ideology when it comes to child safeguarding, the destruction of the category of sex in language, in law, in biology across society, which obviously is hugely destabilising for society across the West, particularly the Anglophone West. And I see so many similarities with forced mass immigration. It has such a huge destabilising impact. And I see the same playbook at play insofar as the actual concerns of ordinary citizens are silenced. There's a media blackout. They're told they are racist, they're far right. Similarly, the concerns of ordinary people vis-a-vis men who say they're women suddenly accessing female spaces. Clearly there's a problem there, but they're told they're transphobes, they're bigots, there's a media blackout. So is there something at play? Is there a meta reason for this? Why are these two trends being pushed so hard in cahoots with the NGO sectors, in both instances with the media, in cahoots with the media, the legacy media, and generally governments, whether they are left or right, seem to be proponents of this. So why is this happening, and is there a reason behind it, because they do seem to be huge, massively destabilizing forces across the Western world, particularly the Anglosphere.
Anybody want to attack that?
Mario? That's a tough one.
I don't know. Why is that happening? It's an excellent question, but I dare not offer any possible theories because I'll come across as a conspiracy theorist. But no one else? No. No one dares.
I want to poke at Mario's magnificent cliffhanger he left us with at the end of that. Maybe I'm spoiling some of the magic there, but what do you mean, or you kind of started touching on it, but what do you mean about we're in a stage that we might have to start managing a decline? Actually, you said it stronger, that we are in a stage that we're going to have to start thinking about managing the decline. Can you speak a little bit more about that, or am I spoiling the movie magic? Or am I making...
No, I didn't realize, I didn't think it was a cliffhanger. I mean, isn't it obvious? Isn't it obvious across the West where we are, what's happening? It's clear, it's apparent where we are. Things are in decline. And we here in this room, and other conservatives and classical liberals too, around Europe and the Americas are trying to find how we're going to respond. How are we going to rebuild? How do we preserve what's left of our culture and our civilization? And how do we move forward? Because there's no turning back a lot of these flows, like I said. I mean, you're hearing people now daring to say remigration now and things like that. I've seen graffiti that way too. Politically, that's impossible. I mean, are you going to remigrate millions of people back to the Maghreb or the Middle East or North Africa? Not going to happen, right? So we're all having these discussions to figure out how are we going to build either around the mess that we've created. How do we incorporate the mess we've created and try to sanitize it? Or do we depart our decrepit cities and move to the country, like some Scandinavian friends of mine are doing, building cabins in the woods? I don't know.
Yeah. To be honest, I'm not sure if there is a master plan for this, or if there should be a master plan given the differences of European national traditions, and given the difference in the definition of national identities in Europe. Like in the case of Britain, being British is does not necessarily link to nationality or religion, given the historical background. Meanwhile, in Germany or France, this is a very, very different issue. So I believe every country remained on his own to define and redefine what does it mean to be a national of this country, and everybody should embrace its own traditions.
Yes, if I can make a comment to your question, and then also, Mari, what you said at the end. I would like to hear your opinion if you think the West is just going to be looking a lot more like one particular country, which is both first and third world, and that is South Africa, where they have private communities, individuals have their own gated compounds. Don't you think this is the future, and how can we as individuals and nation states prepare for that?
Yes.
You had a provocative speech.
Yeah, I did, right? Okay, so I
get
get provocative questions. The gated communities, at least in the United States, began to be constructed decades ago. And Charles Murray wrote about that in the Bell Curve, and then coming apart. And it was the erosion of the old American dream, where rich and poor and baker and banker mingled, lived together. There was a social fabric that's been torn asunder. That's been destroyed, and people are living in gated communities. I don't know if that's begun to happen here in Europe. Gated communities, people isolating themselves from the rest, from the so-called hoi polloi. It's a terrifying vision of the future, to live that way. It kind of reminds me of Blade Runner in a way, if you've ever seen that. There was another part to your question, though, like what to do about it, or am I misreading or reading too much into your question? How to go forward? Again, I don't know. I really don't. Who does? I think we're all searching for that answer.
Thank you. I think it's time to finish our panel. I would like just to make 2 comments. The first one is that if you happen to be in Brussels next week on the 25th of September, Fortus in One Soto are hosting also an event on that topic of migration. I know you, Juan. And also, end of October, ISAPAT is hosting a big congress on the question of family, and I think that the question of family is totally interlinked with the question of migration and demography. So I hope that you will be able to join us to these both events. And once again, I would like to say thank you to our speakers and for your added value to that debate. Thank you.